Okay, we've talked about how Earth's atmosphere has changed since the planet formed. So the planet formed, the atmosphere, the primordial atmosphere gradually evolved into the current atmosphere. We talked about how the oxygen in the atmosphere dramatically impacts the surface of the Earth. Next thing we'll talk about, however, is a heat balance in the atmosphere. So we've got Earth out here in space, and we've got sunlight falling on Earth, heating up the Earth. Now, the Earth will just continue heating up unless it radiates energy off into space. Now, we talked about thermal radiation and black body radiation when we were talking about light back in Chapter 5. And so this is basically what's happening with the Earth. It's absorbing energy from the sun and then radiating it back into space. Now, if it radiates energy into space at the same rate that it absorbs it, then it stays the same temperature. If it radiates faster than it's absorbing, it tends to cool off. And if it's radiating less quickly than it absorbs, then it tends to warm up. And so the atmosphere helps maintain this balance. On the moon, for example, on the night side of the planet, it cools off to 100 degrees below zero. On the day side, it's 100 degrees above zero. And so you have this huge temperature variation between hot and cold on the moon because there's no atmosphere mitigating any of that. So Earth's atmosphere mitigates this. And it does it in a variety of different ways. One way that it mitigates this is that the clouds and the surface of the Earth reflect light back into space. This is called the albedo of the planet. We talked about that earlier. Albedo is how reflective it is. And so, some of the stuff reflects off the ground, some reflects off of clouds, and so that's back into space. So it's not absorbed. So only a fraction of the energy from the sun is actually absorbed on Earth. And then what happens is the Earth's surface warms up, and as it warms up, then it radiates energy back into space. Now, some of the energy goes back into space, but some of it actually is blocked, comes back down. Okay, so something in the atmosphere does that. And the clouds will do that. Just as clouds reflect from above, they reflect from below. And so what can happen is energy coming up hits the clouds and then comes back down. Okay, so that's why on a winter night, when it's cloudy, then it does not get as cold as it does when it's clear. When it's clear, you're radiating energy back into space. Likewise, on a cloudy day, it does not warm up as much typically because the clouds reflect some of the solar energy back into space before it makes it down to the ground. This is the process that typically happens. Okay, now, problem, though, is that it's not just the clouds that are doing this, because the clouds are kind of neutral in this process to a slight degree, but it turns out there's also other gases in the atmosphere that block the energy going back out, and it heats the atmosphere. And, of course, if you heat the atmosphere, you heat the whole planet. And so these gases tend to hold in the heat. This is sometimes called the greenhouse effect because this happens, for example, in a greenhouse, that solar energy comes from space, goes passing through the glass, heats the interior of the greenhouse, and then the energy has trouble getting back out because it's longer wavelength leaving than it is coming in because the surface of the Earth is not nearly as hot as the surface of the sun. Greenhouses aren't that big a thing down here in Texas. I call this your car in the summer effect. Okay, and so what happens is the sunlight goes through the windows of the car, heats the interior of the car, but then the heat has trouble getting back out, and so the interior of the car just gets hotter and hotter and hotter until eventually it maintains a balance, but that balance is dangerously hot. So some of the things that happen in the atmosphere that do this greenhouse effect are most famously carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is the most famous of the greenhouse gases. But water is a greenhouse gas, and people forget that a large chunk of Earth's atmosphere actually has water in it. And so that water is a greenhouse gas. The clouds act as a greenhouse blanket. So that actually is something that's not negligible. We also have methane. Methane is again, a greenhouse gas. What's methane? Methane is natural gas. Methane is also produced by various biological activity. A lot of bacteria will produce methane. There's a lot of things that make methane. And so that acts as a greenhouse gas as well. There are plenty of other greenhouse gases that are out there, some of which are vastly more powerful greenhouse gases than either methane or carbon dioxide, but they're less common. So these things are all acting as greenhouse gases. Now, if you increase the greenhouse gases, that's going to increase the greenhouse effect. It's going to cause Earth not to radiate energy into space as effectively, and it's going to gradually warm up. You decrease greenhouse gases, and it's going to cool off. Now, there are other factors that go into this, because what I just said is a simplistic layman's concept, and it's not entirely correct. There's many other factors that go into this. One of these factors is, of course, albedo changes. And albedo changes, for example, if the Earth gets a little bit warmer, you tend to have more evaporation and more clouds. And so the more clouds that you have, the more energy is blocked from even making it to the ground. So you change the albedo, and there's less energy being absorbed in the first place. This is actually used on a local level. Some cities and places, for example, some cities and regions actually have regulations covering rooftops, for example, saying that rooftops have to be light in color to reflect heat back into space instead of being absorbed. And that cools the city a little bit. So it makes it a little bit cooler. If you have a lot of dark colored roofs, that absorbs the heat and it actually warms up. In the DFW area, we have a lot of dark colored roofs, and so we have what's called the urban heat island effect, and that is all these man-made structures are absorbing heat in the daytime, so it doesn't cool off nearly as much at night. We have feedback mechanisms. So what can sometimes happen is that you change the temperature slightly and something happens. And for example, if you make the Earth slightly warmer, you get more clouds. The clouds work both ways. They can help hold in heat, but they can also reflect the energy back into space and help cool off the planet. So that's a feedback mechanism that's kind of hard to fully grasp what effect that's going to have. Other feedback mechanisms, you heat the Earth, okay, a little bit, and you melt the Arctic ice. That actually would raise the ocean levels. Raise the ocean levels would potentially change the climate of the Earth. Depending on who you ask, that climate would create more rain in places that normally don't get rain, more vegetation. That might push, after hundreds of years, push things back the way they were, or it might push it in the other direction and make it more extreme. So these feedback mechanisms turn out to be very, very complicated, and that's one of the problems with actually understanding how the greenhouse effect works on Earth is all these feedback mechanisms. And we don't really fully understand all of the feedback mechanisms. We do know that some things tend to be self-correcting and other things tend to push it further in the wrong direction. And so those feedback mechanisms are, in fact, major factors that govern how the greenhouse effect works on Earth. Now, should point out here that this is one of the reasons we study other worlds, because when we study other worlds, then we are able to study how the greenhouse effect works with fewer of these other factors involved in there. And so that helps us figure out how these things are actually working on Earth. So basic idea of the atmosphere, greenhouse effect, energy from the sun comes in, some's reflected back into space by the atmosphere, by the ground, by snow, by water, by all these other factors, that change. And again, if you warm the earth a little bit, you get less snow, you get less reflecting, and that warms it even more. That's one of these feedback mechanisms. Okay. Whereas if you warm the earth and it snows more in certain places, because if it's too cold it doesn't snow, then that would be negative feedback. So you have these two different sort of things going on. The surface of the earth warms up, and then it tries to radiate energy back into space. And so the energy radiating back into space is either going to be absorbed by the clouds, water vapor, and gases, and that warms the atmosphere, or it's going to make it back out, or been reflected off cloud. There's a variety of things here that are happening. And again, the science of all this is a little bit complicated, and so a lot of people talking about this don't really understand the science. Okay, now, so what we've talked about here is just natural greenhouse effect, but there is actually human interactions here. Okay, we often think about, humans are producing extra greenhouse gases, and that's warming the earth. And a lot of people think, with that we need to eliminate the greenhouse effect. But it turns out that there's a naturally occurring greenhouse effect. That's what we're talking about right now. Not the man-made one, but the naturally occurring greenhouse effect. The naturally occurring greenhouse effect turns out to be essential for life on Earth. That if there was no greenhouse effect, the average temperature of the Earth would be close to 0 degrees Fahrenheit, or maybe a few degrees below 0. Now, obviously, the average temperature of the Earth is quite a bit warmer than that. Otherwise, it would be frozen solid. And so the oceans would freeze over. And so this is obviously not what's happening. And so there is a greenhouse effect on Earth, and it's essential for life. Now, we now know that the sun, as it ages, gradually gets brighter. That means more energy coming to the Earth. Sun's probably close to 70% brighter now than when it first formed. So that means that if you think about it, the sun was much cooler. And one of the big questions was, well, how come Earth is not still a frozen ball of ice? Why did the oceans not completely froze over? Because if they were completely frozen over, they should not have thawed out yet. And the reason is, in the past, remember, we had a lot more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. This is a greenhouse gas. And that was actually keeping the Earth balmy warm. But as the sun has been getting brighter, the carbon dioxide has been removed from the atmosphere. It's been going into the oceans, precipitating out. It's been converted into oxygen by biologic activity. And so what's happened is that the CO2 has been pulled from the atmosphere at just the right rate to maintain a balance so that Earth is not too hot and Earth is not too cold. Okay. This is what's key, is maintaining this thermal balance right there. And so that's what we're going to pick up with our next lecture here, is that thermal balance.